Hey everyone, I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's case study. I'm genuinely excited about this conversation today. We've had a bunch of conversations leading up to this, which is really neat. And if you aren't familiar with Mount Vernon School, you're definitely going to be familiar with Mount Vernon School on the other side. But first, I want to welcome Kristy Lundström, who's the head of school at Mount Vernon School, and Ann Marsh Rutledge, who's the executive director of MV Ventures. And we're going to kind of understand what MV Ventures is in just a couple of seconds. But both of you, thank you so much for taking time today. I'm excited for our conversation.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And we're going to talk about leadership competencies today, which is something near and dear to my heart. Before we do that, can you both introduce yourselves and learn about Mount Vernon School and then Mount MV Ventures, which is just such a fascinating, connected part of the organization?
Sure, I'll jump in. Great to be here. I'm Kristy Lundström. I serve as head of school. The bricks and mortar day school, as we call it, is located right outside of Atlanta, Georgia, so on the north side of the city. I serve about 900 families. We have 1,250 students, and we are going all the way from preschool up through grade 12. So in about 14 days, I am graduating 119 seniors. So I am a hands-on administrator. At the same time, Mount Vernon is an exciting place to be because, as our last accreditation report said, we're an educator school. So we're a school that really believes both in research-informed and story-informed development. We're a design thinking school where we prototype ideas, iterate with thoughtful feedback, and help each other to grow. It's all grounded in inquiry, right? We believe that transferable skills are the way to empower kiddos in the future. And if we don't practice that as adult learners, we can't really be our best selves for our young people. So we are a learning organization, try to be on the cutting edge. Sometimes we have to think about maybe a few can go first. And so you'll see a lot of pilot and scale. And that's a lot of what Ann Marsh helps us do through her work.
Yeah, Kristy, thanks for the introduction. And I am just, thrilled that I get to serve as executive director at Mount Vernon Ventures. And we are basically the research and development and consulting division of the Mount Vernon School. So we are actually part of the Mount Vernon School. Most of my consultants are actually faculty and staff who are working day to day at Mount Vernon. So really being invested in the work in the day-to-day in a way that you don't typically see in a consulting firm. Really the place that we feel most passionate about is the place where research and practice meet. And what does that actually look like when research is put into practice in the classroom and with our administrators and leaders? So that's the work that I get to do with our partner schools who are all over the country and even internationally. And it's a pleasure to get to walk alongside them in their journeys and help guide their transformation.
Yeah, I just am fascinated by the model, right? No secret. Yeah, and if you're new to this series, then maybe it's the first time you're hearing this. But if you've watched a couple, I'm just fascinated by schools that are iterating the business model. And in fact, Brett Jacobson, who's CEO, and I know he's heading off to Southern Association of Independent Schools, had given a session for me about how you constructed the iterations to the model and it's just fascinating. If anybody's interested in it, I've got some stuff on the website about it, but that's probably another episode down the line. But today we're here to talk about leadership competencies, and specifically, no surprise, right? You're a learning organization, very iterative, design thinking focused, all the things. How did you start thinking about leadership competencies that are essential for independent school folks to be successful? I'd love to hear more about that.
I think it's been a journey and a conversation that is ongoing, and working with highly competent, passionate leaders thinking about how to hone their craft. One of the principles and sort of theories or ideas that we ground my leadership team in is Trust and Aspire with Stephen Covey. So this is this approach where you can, put together the ideas of how you connect to the why, how you model, and then how you sort of walk the walk. And so when we started thinking about if this is the essence of what we want our leadership team to have as behaviors, what does that really look like? How do we measure it? How do we practice it? How do we develop our competencies? And we're a CBE school, so that made perfect sense to us. And oddly enough, they were not articulated specifically in the way that we had already done a competency outline for our teachers. So we have competencies already lined up for what we believe is a great teacher and how we help grow and lead our teachers. So we started to think about what would a leader for right now, what are those competencies? What would they need? And so we did a really deep dive into like tons of organizations, nonprofit, governmental, military, schools, Fortune 500, and looked at what competencies or behaviors were they calling out. And we looked in culture guides, we looked in different examples of job descriptions, and we began to see trends. And then we looked at future jobs reports, and we started thinking about both McKinsey, HBR, thinking about the World Economic Forum. What competencies were they calling on for employees of the future that would be transferable? And one of our mantras is lead from where you are. And if we were going to lean into that across the board, we needed to know what we were talking about. And so we went on a journey to develop these 20 competencies that now guide our growth and our evaluation.
So what are, 20 is a lot for you to recite from memory, but what are some of the competencies that are in that group?
Demonstrating an ethic of excellence is one. Being a storyteller with conviction is one. Being able to use data to drive ethical decision-making is one. And so how can we evolve systems to serve the whole? These are different. I think you would recognize many of them. What we did was bucket them and put them in a place where I can figure out where are my strengths and what do I bring to the team. We're a strengths-based organization. And then where are my, as we call them, grows and glows? Where are my grows, right? Where do I need to lean in and learn more? And who's the person in my organization who can help me? Because once we mapped it all out, now we know who to connect in different projects.
I think one of the ways we Peter has made it more accessible is thinking about like kind of buckets of investing in others and investing in the organization, just to look at the different scale. Like, are we building systems thinking, or are we talking about giving feedback to an individual? And so that kind of helps, I think, too, in determining, investing in others, investing in the organization as a whole, the vision.
What was the process like? What's fascinating to me is like all the different places you looked to find the competencies. How did that all unfold?
Well, we're lucky. We work with a really talented colleague who he's the Chief Talent Experience Officer here in our organization. And he was very curious. We got to pose essential questions. Like, these are the questions we're hoping to find the answers for. And what work, what sources, what media deep dive do we need to do? What do we know and what do we need to know? And we used our visible thinking routines. We have a compass guide that helps us anytime we design a solution. We go through these steps of figuring out what do we know, what do we need to know. And so we used our system of approach to a solution, finding a solution, being a solution seeker, to this problem that was in front of us, and how do we outline the specific competencies. So he guided our process. We were lucky to have him lead our team.
How long did it take? It sounds like this was a pretty significant project.
Well, no, Ann Marsh. We did it in iterations. We had different prototypes that were raw and rawer. 6 months over time. I would say we were a small sort of hot team working on it for a while, and then we began to put out some of our second and third iterations to a larger group. And the final iteration went to our entire connecting leader and executive leader group, sort of for like, here we are. We're going to go with this for a year before we evaluate and tweak again. So we typically do things in versions. And we're probably on version 3.2 right now.
Yeah, we've definitely learned a lot along the way. And we're lucky at Mount Vernon to have a learning and development team within the school that really looks at those. So having somebody, you know this from your work with schools, Peter, but creating the urgency within our organization, having somebody who can lead the vision, but then really collaborating with a diverse team so that we can get the best next iteration. And, there are a lot of things that we learned along the way about how to make it stronger, how to make it better, what our implementation process should be, those kinds of things for sure.
I know you work off of like EOS, and if folks aren't familiar with EOS, I highly encourage you to read the book Traction. It's a good intro to the philosophy. Was this one of your goals for the year? Oh, there it is right there.
What the heck is EOS right here?
Yeah. I'm actually going to have an EOS implementer come into Moonshot Lab. They're going to talk about.
Okay.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty cool. What was this one of your goals for the year? Like, was that stated?
It was last year. So it was a traction item for last year. This has been our first year of sort of implementing or letting it guide our work. So last year it was a traction item to develop, iterate, and sort of launch. And that was 22-23. So we've used them actively in 23-24.
And the reason I ask is because it establishes that as a priority, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it emerged from the user. So leaders within our organization were asking, well, what are the competencies my performance would be evaluated on, or how could I demonstrate growth? Because we were doing that with our teachers. So we saw that in the practice of teaching and learning. And of course, that's what we do with our students. So it was a natural development for us to really we do need to think deeply about our leadership. And it actually creates a shared understanding of language as well. This is what we're talking about. Yeah. This is what we know.
Yeah. Yeah. I am curious, so I know you've got your competencies for teachers, you now have your competencies for leaders. Like, what's the dividing line? I'm just curious, when does somebody get measured on the teacher competencies? Like, is it a department chair, division? I'm just curious how that all works.
It's both. We believe anybody's a leader. You're a leader in your space, wherever you are. You're a leader on your team. You're a leader of yourself.
That's what I was trying to get at. Yeah.
In the organization. So lead yourself, lead the organization, lead others. So these competencies are open to any employee, wherever you are. And the way our system works is you pick it's called me and we. So you pick the 4 competencies that you really want to work on. And the we competencies are typically a team that's working on them together, or division. And your role might call for a we competency, but anyone can choose leadership.
Oh, I love that.
I think our teacher competencies tend to be a lot of the skills and competencies that you need to be successful in the classroom. And that was what was really driving the need for these leadership competencies, because especially for those of us who are not every single day in front of a group of kids, things like designing instruction are more from a coaching capacity. And so having those competencies that name out how we coach people and what matters, it certainly is something that all of our teachers can work towards as well. But it was definitely needed for those of us outside the classroom.
And Kristy, I love how you framed it as like the me versus we. That's really smart, because there are competencies at the group level that need to be encouraged and fostered. And it's like subtle, but it's really smart. I appreciate how you got there. Was that by design initially, or is that something you kind of learned along the way?
Oh my gosh, we had so many conversations about this. But actually, that was a teacher suggested iteration on one of the early prototypes, that we wanted to have choice, and we know how important that is in terms of agency and buy-in and influence. But we also recognize that we would need to steer the vision and the EOS traction items that we were working on as an organization. So how could we meet in the middle? And then this we kept coming out, like, well, we want to do this and we want to do this. And so that's how we began to land. And it took off at first in the rhetoric, and we didn't have a system. And they were like, well, let's just call it me and we. So,
Right.
okay.
Yeah, now it's part of your shared language, right?
I think that really speaks to the collaborative nature of our teams and the desire to have a team goal that really drove that. So,
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I mean, so I'm kind of nerding out just because I love your systems, right? I just, my brain thinks the same way. So it's really fun for me to see schools implementing it so successfully. So, but let's focus on like the me goals for a second. So imagine out of the 20, I pick 4 or 5 that I really want to work on this year. How does Mount Vernon provide space to work on that? Like, what does that look like from a professional development perspective?
I'm going to focus on the leadership ones, and I would say it looks different for different leaders in different roles. So if you have a very teacher learning, classroom-facing leadership moment, you may be tied to a schedule of how and when you do learning walks and coach. And so your playlist would be done at a different time if you're geared toward a schedule. If you are more in the office side of the school and you have mornings where you can dedicate a free time and then have, your meeting scheduled around or whatever. Every adult at school, every person here, every learner has a GTD time in their day. Is getting things done. And this execution time, you have autonomy over. And so if you wanted to work on your playlist, that's typically how learning happens. We have coaches for every role. You and your coach might brainstorm a playlist and then you work through it or have a friend who works through it, or Ann Marsh identifies a conference that you go to or partner with, or you participate in a podcast like this. How might we learn and really expand that idea well beyond reading an article? Because if you don't wrestle with it a little bit, the stickiness of it all. So we try also to pair 2 people who have the same me. So if Ann Marsh and I are both working on coaching, then we might do a deep dive together.
I think there's something special about the way that selecting the me and we elements it's like a filter for our reflective practice also. So we keep a portfolio just like we would ask our learners to do. And so constantly through the lens of these elements, for example, building relationships of trust, like you're constantly filtering your experiences through that element and reflecting on how have I grown from this? What do I still need to do? How can I continue to build in this skill? So the reflective process for sure is a huge part of it.
Can I ask a couple of nerdy questions?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how do they manage that portfolio? Like, is there a system that you use? Does everybody have a different spin on it?
We're both kind of laughing because this has been a constant iteration too.
So we want to build the idea and then find the system that matches it.
Right. Sure.
But there's a point in the design, and I think we're there, right? We can't get much further until we find a system that supports it, what we're trying to do. And so right now we're trying to force fit a system we already have. And we have a lot of LMSs in our organization. So we have one LMS for the online school, one LMS for the upper school, and one LMS for the lower school. And we were like, pick one. So we picked the one we thought would be the most transferable to, very portfolio driven. The idea of artifacts and evidence is how you manage the reflection process. It's called Toddle. We're in a testing year. I don't think we love it and all the parts, but we're having to retrofit it for adult learners, and that's the tricky part. We are excited about Toddle for our lower campus. We feel like, so that's one use case, but in this case, we're still wondering if there's a better solution. Some people go rogue and they started their own Google Doc. So there's this whole Google group out there. It's like, y'all are all going to change systems. And so we're just going to keep it and plop it into whatever system you have. So like, there's some rogue groups out here.
I'm one of those.
You're one of them. Yeah.
There's a rogue. One group has started their own Google site, and they're just sharing a Google site within their team. And that's been okay. We've allowed that to expand this year in different directions because we actually think that's an interesting reflection at the end of this year. Like, which one worked better?
I was just going to say.
One took the least amount of time, has the highest quality and fidelity around adoption.
And we've
So-
discussed that in 15 years, the only platform we've stayed with has been Google. And so there's a consistency and longevity factor that we know. And most of our people draft in Google anyways and then upload. So it's sort of reducing a step, but it also isn't perfect.
Yeah,
So.
that is really hard. When we're finished and off, I've got a recommendation of something you may want to look at. So we'll hang there. The other question I had, and so this is the second nerdy question I have, you had mentioned GTD, right? Getting things done. I literally have had so many conversations with heads of school and others in like the association world around how like people are just so overwhelmed right now. There's just so many things that they're asked to do and by necessity, right? How do you carve out that space? I'm just super curious. Like, how do you make time in the day for folks to be able to have that really important time?
Well, for kids, we schedule it. It's literally a scheduled time on their computer every day. For leaders, of course, who govern their own time, I would say it works itself out 50%. And the other 50% is up to the coach to remind the learner. So if I'm Ann Marsh's coach, which I happen to be sometimes, I'll say, Ann Marsh, when's your GTD time? And sort of hold her, we call it holding her capable. I'm holding her capable of getting the work done. And it's not a gotcha moment, but it is a recommitment to the system. And whenever we do it, we think about, it's just this reminder of if you don't, it's too hard. It becomes a crash on your personal time or in that like balance, which is a funny phrase. But one of our elements is essentializing. And so if we call them elements. One of our competencies is essentializing. And so we can always, as a coach, I can always say, this is an area where you need to grow, right? Like, so it is actually called out as a competency that you need to be able to essentialize what's in front of you. And as coaches, we're called to remind you.
I think we be, those really practical things like actually blocking your calendar. And I tried to do that with my own project management, and it's very color coded in Google Calendar. But, those are the kinds of executive function skills that are really important for adults, just like they are for kids, and that some of us have greater competency in than others. And that's kind of the beauty of having a team who can support each other and help scaffold that for those who need more support in making a boundary on how they get things done.
Well, and normalizing it too, right? Like this is who we are. This is part of our DNA. Like that's so powerful. I mean, every Monday morning I do like a weekly review where I just go through all of my like calendar items, my to-dos, and kind of organize things and make sure I'm feeling good about the week ahead. But it doesn't take me out. It's like 30 minutes, right? And that's kind of setting that time aside, though, has been really important for me. It took me a long time to figure out to do that, but once I did, it was like, I wish I'd done that a long time ago.
Same.
So I'm curious. So now you have competencies, and this is really kind of year one. You're coming to a close of year one of the first year of the rollout. Is that right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How do you assess growth within those competencies?
So we use a mastery scale. But we're not using the same scale that we use with young people. So it's not from novice to advanced. We use the NEPAD scale for kids. But for adults, it is researching, designing, iterating, and consulting. And so depending on the evidence and your own self-evaluation and the evaluation of your supervisor, it depends on, are we talking growth or are we talking evaluation? But this is the scale where we rate ourselves. And so it's funny, we're having this conversation because I was just now putting the next assignment into our LMS where each leader will assess themselves and they will actually place themselves on the scale and then give evidence of their needs, their 4 competencies.
Who do they give evidence to? Is that to their coach or is it somebody else? Or
it's usually if we share, unless you specifically have. I think they're all pretty transparent, don't you, Ann Marsh? Yeah, it's out there in our LMS for everybody to see and be inspired by or add to. Because sometimes your evidence is a team project, and so it makes sense to load it up for Ann Marsh and myself, and we talk about it, and it's an example. Or the coach could even say, hey, in a feedback moment, Ann Marsh, that was an interesting project, and I can definitely see where you were going. You missed the mark a little. So if you iterate it again, and then you could use it in your portfolio. So we try and push it back to reinforce the idea of capturing evidence.
And definitely having conversation about the reflection is very important. And, there's so much that comes out in the conversation. In fact, earlier this year, when Kristy and I were connecting about sort of my mid-year reflection, she said, some of these things I knew about and some of them are new. And so that was a moment even for me to realize, the conversation is so important on all of us aligning and figuring out where we are, because there's so many things that your coach, your supervisor doesn't see all elements of your day. And people are complex. They serve multiple different roles, and especially in a school with lots of priorities, we can't all see everything at once. So having both the reflective practice and the conversation is important.
Yeah. And so what's interesting, there's so much about this that's interesting to me, but I know that you all have done a lot of work thinking about like the future of work, right? Like what is work going to look like in 2030, 2035, pick the year. How do you think this is important to the future needs of independent schools? Like obviously this is intentional and you've put great importance behind this, but like, how are you orienting it to, the next 10 years and what you think independent schools might look like?
Yeah, I have a thought about that, Kristy, if you don't mind me asking.
I do too. Let's see if we have the same.
Okay, good. The future work is definitely something that's been really important for us. So we've got some research coming out on futures thinking in May, actually later this month. But I think one of the unique things about competencies as opposed to skills are something that you practice and you hone through experience. But competencies are preparing you for the unknown, right? So they might not look like, the practice cases aren't all the same, but building relationships of trust, for example, we know that that's going to be something that continues to be important in the future. In fact, probably more important as we see the rise of misinformation and disinformation continuing. That trust is so important, but it prepares you for the next novel thing. And that's going to be really important. We think as we know that the next 10 years probably won't look the same as the past 10 years. Right, Kristy, is that what you were thinking or something different?
Yeah, we're totally on the same path. I also manage talent, right? So I'm an employer of 274 employees, and I don't know which roles will disappear. And so I really need transferable competencies so that all the investment, all the loyalty, all the learning that has happened, you don't walk away with the role, but you move and evolve within the organization. I'm very influenced by the futures about the people who can work with AI will outpace and outwork the AI. So what are the human differentiators? And I believe some of our competencies speak to the human differentiators, and maybe they will emerge as the top tier. Like that's one thing I'm wondering right now. You said it yourself, 20's a lot, right? But are some more important than others? Like we're thinking about, is there a hierarchy or a foundation? And would that shift over time? Like, do I think these are going to stand the test of time? That's to be seen. Some will fall away. I think some are core, some are central, just because they're in the human connection. But are some going to be more important than others? I think that's an interesting discussion that I really want to see us explore in year 2.
Yeah, if I had to bet now, I'd bet yes, absolutely things will. The order will shake up over time as the world changes. That makes that makes a lot of sense. But what also makes sense is like if you focus on these competencies and you grow in those areas and develop the skills underneath to bolster the competencies, like how do you see this being able to help schools in terms of like rethinking the business model? Because obviously that's something I'm really passionate about, but this feels like a really essential ingredient, but I'd love for you to to talk about that.
One of our competencies is entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship. And so that right itself brings it some emphasis or focus to what you're describing. I am excited too that the mastery scale we're using with adults has iteration in it. And I believe the agility of an organization is going to be essential moving forward. And so how do we continually reinforce agility? Well, if that's third highest at the competency level, if you think of mastery, this iteration, agility, commitment to reflection, in a way, it's the learning cycle that is going to hold up whatever business we need to develop. Launching, Ann Marsh and I have done a lot of work with launching the online school, and it's a grind. It's a great idea with a lot of details. And so how do you reinforce the commitment to the grind at the same time as nurture the creativity of the idea? And so, I don't know, I'm thinking a lot about, even if we changed out the competencies, would the system hold up? And I like where our mastery sort of scale is in terms of reinforcing our prototype, pilot and scale, idea to action approach. I don't know. Ann Marsh, does that make sense?
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think that idea of being a learning organization who is trying to design for future generations in a, somewhat unknowable future, we have signs of what's going to be important, but we have said over and over again within our organization that we are committed to learning, and that learning quickly is going to be one of the most important skills of the future. That Brett has always said, what got us here won't get us there. Like we just know, that process of investing in learning and not being static is really a lot of the secret sauce. I mean, an element by itself, like leveraging systems, is probably going to be important into the future, no matter what the system is. But I agree with Kristy. It's more about the process.
Yeah. Hey, so as we wrap up, let's put our consulting hat on for a second here. Imagine a school. They get to the end of this, they're like, there's a lot there. Like I'm really interested in developing competencies for my school. If they were going to call you tomorrow and said, where do I start? Like, what would you recommend? Because obviously this was like a 6-month process for you, so very in depth and lots of prototyping and iteration, all the things. But I'm curious, what's the first thing they should do?
You want me to take that one? Well, I guess another follow-up question that I would have is, do they want to develop their own and go through the process as a moment of learning for themselves, or do they want help in implementing the system that we have created? And it's always our hope that the purest form is that we would empower their team and be alongside them as they do the research and support them in the decision-making process. But through the research, there were a lot of things that came out that, weren't as big as for us the way that we put it into practice with our people. And so I would say that kind of knowing what your end is. Are you trying to empower your organization to develop new things, or is it really just about the competencies and you want help implementing those? And thinking about your end goals there would be where I'd start. What would you add, Kristy?
I mean, the devil is in the details. I might start high level. The big buckets of invest in self, invest in others, invest in the organization. You could start with those 3 circles and get a bunch of sticky notes and begin to think about what behaviors make that possible. And when you start to think about the behaviors that create possibility, you're starting to move towards what we would need to learn to be able to do it well. But it's not that easy. I respect that. I honor the time and effort it would take. I just think jump in somewhere, right? Draw 3 circles on a whiteboard and get some sticky notes. And I would bucket it in the beginning. Invest in self, invest in others, invest in the organization.
Yeah, that's a good framework or a good lens to look through to get to that place. Hey, so Kristy Lundström, Ann Marsh Rutledge, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today and the work that you're doing at Mount Vernon School and Mount Vernon Ventures. This has been terrific.
Thanks, Peter.
Come to Atlanta.